The front of the German column faltered at the unexpected sight. Just over 60 Russians, suffering from catastrophic respiratory failure, pulled themselves forward through the poison gas. They urgently charged along the railway embankment and climbed out of the trenches on both sides to drive their bayonets into the German front line. Through the deadly green mist of the pre-dawn darkness, they resisted the effects of biochemistry to attack a force that outnumbered them 100 to 1. The repulse of the German advance at the Osowiec Fortress, in what is now northeastern Poland, became the final violent defense of a geographic bottleneck that helped hold the map of the 20th century in place. In the summer of 1915, the Russian Empire was carrying out a massive fighting withdrawal to prevent total encirclement. Osowiec, a four-part complex of brick, limestone, and concrete sunk deep into earthen ramparts, served as the hinge of that movement. If the Germans captured Osowiec Fortress, the Russian front would break, trapping 500,000 men and potentially giving Germany and the Central Powers a chance at a winnable single-front war. But the surrounding geography was extremely challenging. To the north and south of Osowiec Fortress lay the Biebrza Marshes, a prehistoric maze of peat bogs and reed beds that stretched for nearly 50 miles in every direction. There was no stable ground for advancing or repositioning the massive siege artillery the Germans required to capture the Russian stronghold. The only dependable ground for nearly 50 miles was the railway embankment. This was a man-made ridge of tightly packed earth and stone carrying the railway, which served as the main artery of the Russian supply line. Osowiec acted as the lock on the gate. For 6 months, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg had applied sustained military pressure. He deployed Big Bertha howitzers, 420mm weapons that fired shells weighing more than 2,000 pounds. While the fortress's concrete and earth-shielded walls absorbed the direct impacts, while the shells also struck the forward embankment, turning the narrow approach into a field of craters nearly 30 feet deep. Inside the fortress, the defenders existed in a subterranean environment of damp, poorly ventilated bunkers. The 226th Zemlyansky Regiment remained in the lower magazines, wading through the bombardment. By August, Hindenburg accepted that ballistics alone would not open the path. The fortress walls were too strong, and the bogs were too unstable to move the guns closer. He instead turned to fluid dynamics. He ordered Major General Rudolf von Freudenberg to deploy 150 tons of a chlorine-bromine mixture, a massive industrial-scale use of chemical warfare that, until that summer, had no precedent in the history of human conflict. Freudenberg's engineers installed 30 complex gas release stations spaced at 400-foot intervals along the edge of the marsh, carefully hiding them in the vegetation. They understood that the pre-dawn stillness would allow the cloud to behave like a liquid, flowing into every low point in the terrain. At 4 a.m. on August 6th, the German engineers opened the master valves on the 30 concealed gas batteries. Within seconds, the jets spread outward and combined, forming a dense yellow-green wall about 30 feet high and miles wide. 150 tons of chlorine and bromine moved over the marsh grass at the speed of a slow walk. It swept across the valley floor, instantly drying plant life into brittle remains upon contact. As the gas wall reached the Russian forward bridgehead, the chemistry of the valley changed completely. Because the vapors were heavier than air, they behaved like a liquid, a destructive fluid sliding into trench lines and pouring down the fortress ventilation shafts, reaching the underground magazines where steel shells could not penetrate. Chlorine seeks moisture. When the cloud reached the Russian 9th, 10th, and 11th companies, the gas quickly bonded with the moisture in the men's eyes, throats, and lungs. The resulting reaction, the formation of hydrochloric acid inside the body, caused catastrophic physical failure. On the front lines, nearly 1,600 men entered a state of physiological collapse. Almost everyone in the outer trenches died quickly, their bodies falling into waist-deep pools of poison that collected at the bottom of the pits. Their skin darkened to a bruised purple as their organs failed. The gas also damaged machinery. The chemical saturation acted as a powerful corrosive. Copper components in the field telephones broke down into green dust, and the firing pins of the Russian rifles locked inside their bolts. By 4:15 a.m., the forward sector had become a silent occupied zone. The gas continued drifting, seeping into the central fortress, where it claimed another 400 Russian soldiers. Inside the central citadel, 21-year-old officer Vladimir Kotlinski was inside a low-ceiling casemate trapped within this same architectural channel. For an improvised face covering, he soaked his undershirt in urine, knowing it would partly neutralize the chlorine and slow the acidic reaction in his lungs just enough to remain conscious. Kotlinski gathered several dozen others who had not yet succumbed. Because the gas had jammed the internal firing pins of their Mosin-Nagant rifles, they fixed bayonets instead. The German column advanced between the forward trenches, passing the poisoned remains of the 9th Company. Freudenberg, watching from the rear, believed the route into the fortress was now open. The German soldiers wore rubberized masks, which restricted their breathing and limited their side vision to roughly 30 degrees. Kotlinski's group advanced toward them through the remaining mist of poison gas for nearly 1,000 yards. They became visible only at close fighting distance. At the same time, scattered surviving Russians from the forward trenches, disorganized and severely weakened, began pulling themselves out of the gas and mud, climbing both sides of the embankment to support the counterattack. The clash on the embankment became confused and disorderly. The 1st German rank, affected by fogged lenses on their rubber masks, struggled to aim accurately. They encountered a force that carried clear physical signs of gas exposure. Men with faces wrapped in heavily stained cloth and skin darkened from oxygen deprivation. Soldiers they had assumed were already dead. It formed an unexpected pincer movement and presented a shocking appearance. The front rank had pulled back at the unexpected movement of surviving defenders, but the 7,000 unaware Germans further behind in line continued to advance. The opposing pressure forced German soldiers off the reinforced earthwork and into the dark water bogs. The weight of their 60-pound packs held them down in the peat. When the first Russian bayonets struck their targets, the German formation entered a state of mechanical collapse. Surviving Russian artillery crews inside the citadel, struggling with damaged eyesight, began estimating the range. Their heavy fortress guns, too large to be disabled by the corrosion that had ruined their rifles, remained operational. They could not see clearly, so they fired based on memory. The heavy shells struck the center of the retreating mass, breaking apart the remaining German assault in bursts of granite ballast and gray uniforms. The Germans withdrew in panic. Kotlinski died later that evening in the fortress infirmary. By the end of the week, nearly every man who had fought beside him was dead. Their internal organs had suffered severe damage. They had exchanged their remaining hours of life for the opportunity to repel those responsible for the chemical assault. Of the 3,000 Russians stationed in the forward garrison, more than 2,200 were officially recorded as casualties from the gas and the following combat. The true number of survivors remains unknown. The German losses exceeded 1,000 men, resulting from the bayonet assault, the marshlands, and the final artillery fire. Osowiec Fortress continued to hold for another 3 weeks. When the Russians finally withdrew on August 18th, they had placed enough explosives to destroy the limestone foundations, denying the German military its strategic objective: a stable base for heavy siege guns, a logistical center for deeper advances, and protected shelter for up to 10,000 troops. The delay allowed the Russian army to complete its large-scale retreat, preventing total encirclement of the Tsar's forces and keeping Russia engaged in World War I for 2 additional years. This forced Germany to keep millions of troops committed in the east, preventing a major reinforcement of the Western Front that might have ended the war in victory for the Central Powers. The chemical assault proved extremely deadly, but the German offensive ultimately failed, turning into a retreat at the hands of fewer than 100 men who refused to surrender their position.